A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
Hey everyone, welcome back to My Weird Prompts. We are coming to you from our house here in Jerusalem, and I have to say, the energy in the room today is a little different. I have been staring at a stack of policy papers all morning, trying to make sense of the world, and honestly, it feels like I'm looking at a magic trick where I can see the rabbit, but I cannot find the hat. It is that feeling of being surrounded by information, but sensing that the most important parts are being intentionally hidden from view.
Herman Poppleberry here, and Corn, I know exactly what you mean. It is that feeling of looking at a polished 300-page report with high-quality charts, heavy cardstock, and a list of experts with more degrees than a thermometer, and thinking, this looks like objective truth, but who actually paid for the ink? Our housemate Daniel sent us a prompt this week that really gets into the gears of how the world is actually run, behind the scenes of the headlines we see every day. It is an investigation into the opaque world of think tanks.
Yeah, Daniel was asking about the world of think tanks. It is one of those terms we hear constantly on the news. You know, a senior fellow from this institute or an analyst from that council. But when you actually peel back the layers, it is an incredibly opaque ecosystem. We are talking about over 11,000 organizations globally that basically function as the architectural office for government policy. They are the ones who design the blueprints that politicians eventually sign into law.
It is fascinating because the term itself, think tank, actually started as mid-20th century American military slang for the human brain. It was this informal, almost cheeky way of describing where the ideas come from. But after World War II, it morphed into these massive multi-million-dollar institutions. And today, especially with everything happening in the world in March of 2026, they have become a sort of shadow branch of government.
It is the shadow branch that never stands for election. That is the part that always gets me. We are going to dive deep into this today. We will look at the history, the staggering lack of transparency in their funding, and how the massive shift in government spending over the last year has fundamentally changed their business model. We are going to look at how these groups have transitioned from being academic retreats into what many are calling corporate-funded mercenaries.
We have to talk about that 92% drop in USAID funding from early 2025. That single event sent shockwaves through the global policy world. It was a total decapitation of the traditional funding model for international development research that forced these institutions to look elsewhere for money, and where they found it tells you everything you need to know about why certain policies get pushed over others. When the government stops paying you to think about peace, you start looking for someone who will pay you to think about war.
Right, and we will also get into the revolving door, that cycle where people move from a think tank to a high-ranking government position and then back again. It is a closed-loop system. So, Herman, let us start at the beginning. If we have over 11,000 of these groups worldwide, how did we get here? This was not always the way policy was made, right? I mean, back in the day, didn't politicians just, have ideas?
Well, they had ideas, but they realized early on that ideas carry more weight if they are backed by the veneer of scientific objectivity. In the early 20th century, you had the birth of the foundational American think tanks. You had the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in 1910, the Brookings Institution in 1916, the Hoover Institution in 1919, and the Council on Foreign Relations in 1921. Back then, the idea was actually quite noble, at least on the surface. The goal was to bring scientific management and academic rigor to the messy, emotional world of politics.
It was the progressive era mindset, right? The belief that if you just got enough smart people in a room with enough data, you could solve poverty or war like an engineering problem. It was the age of the expert.
Precisely. It was about creating a bridge between the world of ideas and the world of action, But the real turning point, the moment the modern think tank was truly born, was 1946 with the creation of the RAND Corporation. That was the first time we saw the high-tech, defense-oriented think tank. It was originally a project of the Douglas Aircraft Company to provide research to the United States Air Force. That set the template for what we see today, a private organization funded by the government to think about the unthinkable, specifically nuclear war and global strategy.
And that brings us to the present day. You mentioned that these groups are now the architects of policy. But there is a huge distinction we need to make here, which is the difference between a research-first model and an advocacy-first model. Because when I read a report from RAND versus a report from, say, a more partisan group, the tone is totally different. One feels like a lab report, the other feels like a manifesto.
That is the crucial divide. A research-first think tank, at least in theory, starts with a question and follows the data to a conclusion, wherever it leads. An advocacy-first think tank starts with a conclusion, like we need to increase the defense budget, or we need to deregulate the energy sector, and then they hire researchers to find the data that supports it. They are essentially high-end PR firms that use the language of academia. The problem for the average person is that both types of organizations use the same branding. They both use footnotes, they both have experts with PhDs, and they both have very professional-looking websites with names like the Institute for Strategic something or other.
It is a branding exercise. It is about manufacturing credibility. And this is where the money comes in. I was looking at the numbers Daniel mentioned in the prompt, and they are honestly startling. Only 35% of North American think tanks actually disclose who funds them. That means for nearly 2/3 of these groups, we have no idea whose interests they are representing. We are reading their reports as if they are objective truth, but they could be written by someone whose salary is paid by a foreign government or a massive corporation with a direct stake in the outcome.
It gets even worse when you look at foreign policy specifically. Among the top 50 foreign policy think tanks in the United States, 36% are classified as dark money organizations. They are essentially black boxes. You could have a foreign government, a massive multinational corporation, or a billionaire with a specific agenda pouring millions into a group, and that group then produces a report that ends up on the desk of a senator. The senator treats it like objective research, but it is effectively a paid advertisement disguised as a white paper.
It is reputation laundering. We actually talked about this in episode 987, how the ultra-wealthy use different institutions to edit their public image and push their interests. Think tanks are the gold standard for that. If you are a defense contractor and you want the government to buy a new missile system, you do not just run a TV ad. That is too obvious. Instead, you fund a fellowship at a prestigious think tank. That fellow then writes an op-ed in the New York Times about the growing threat from a specific region, citing the need for better missile defense.
And then that same fellow gets called to testify before Congress as an independent expert. It is a very sophisticated form of lobbying, and because it is a non-profit think tank, it does not carry the same stigma as a traditional K Street lobbying firm. People hear senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and they think scholar. They do not think paid representative of a drone manufacturer. It is a way to bypass the public's natural skepticism of corporate interests.
Speaking of manufacturers, the prompt mentioned that 9 major Pentagon contractors, including firms like Palantir and Deloitte and McKinsey, have documented ties to the top US think tanks. When we look at the current situation with the Iran conflict, which we analyzed in episode 645 and again in episode 1009, you see these names everywhere. These firms are not just providing the technology for the war, they are providing the intellectual justification for it through the think tanks they fund.
You really do. And the shift in early 2025 was a massive catalyst for this. When the United States government slashed USAID funding by over 90%, it created a massive hole in the budgets of these organizations. If you are a think tank that relies on government grants to survive, and those grants disappear overnight because of a change in political winds, you have to find a new patron. And who has the most money to spend on policy influence right now? It is the big defense firms and foreign governments who want to shape American interventionism.
It is a survival instinct. If the government stops paying you to think about how to build schools in developing nations, or how to improve agricultural yields, you start looking for someone who will pay you to think about how to win a regional war, or how to secure a supply chain for rare earth minerals. This is why we have seen such a surge in hawkish commentary lately. Groups like the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, or WINEP, and the Foundation for Defense of Democracies have been incredibly active. They are providing the intellectual framework for the current escalations in the Middle East.
And it is important to understand the mechanism of the revolving door here. This is not just about money, it is about careers. Think tanks serve as a holding pattern for government officials. When an administration changes, or when someone leaves a high-level post at the Pentagon or the State Department, they do not just go get a normal job. They go to a think tank. They spend 4 years writing papers, keeping their name in the mix, appearing on cable news, and then when the next administration comes in or a new crisis hits, they get tapped to go back into government.
So they are effectively writing the policy they intend to implement 6 months later. It is a self-fulfilling prophecy. They create the demand for a specific policy while they're out of office, and then they become the supply of leadership to execute that policy once they're back in. It is a closed-loop system where the same 300 people just trade seats every 4 to 8 years.
It creates this monoculture where new ideas struggle to break through because the entire system is designed to reward the status quo or the interests of the donors. If you are a young researcher at one of these big groups and you write a paper suggesting that we should actually decrease our military footprint or that the current strategy is failing, you are probably not going to get that paper published, and you certainly are not going to get promoted. The incentives are all aligned toward the people who sign the checks.
I want to talk about the legislative pushback to this, because it feels like people are finally starting to wake up to the danger of this shadow government. You mentioned Congressman Lance Gooden and his 2025 bill. For those who are not following the minutiae of Capitol Hill, what was that bill trying to do?
The Gooden Bill, which was officially the Think Tank Transparency Act of 2025, was a direct response to this transparency crisis. It essentially aimed to force think tanks to disclose any foreign funding over a certain threshold if they wanted to maintain their tax-exempt status or their access to classified government briefings. It was a huge deal because it hit them where it hurts, their wallets and their influence, but the pushback was intense. You had groups like the Center for American Progress actually making moves to hide their donor lists even further, claiming they were trying to avoid political retaliation or donor harassment.
Which is a very convenient excuse. I mean, if you are a nonprofit that is influencing public policy and shaping the laws of the land, the public has a right to know who is paying for that influence. It is the same logic we apply to campaign finance. Why should policy finance be any different? If a billionaire can buy a policy paper that changes the tax code, that is just as impactful as buying a TV ad for a candidate.
It should not be different, but the think tank world has operated in this gray zone for decades. They are technically 501c3 nonprofits, which means they are supposed to be for the public good. But when they are effectively acting as outsourced research and development for private corporations or foreign entities, that classification starts to look pretty flimsy. They are essentially lobbying firms that do not have to register as lobbyists.
It is also interesting to look at the global variance here. We're talking a lot about the US model, but the prompt pointed out that in authoritarian states, it is a completely different animal. Over there, you do not even have this illusion of independence. The research institutes are just direct organs of the state.
Right. In places like China or Russia, a think tank is essentially a propaganda office with better academic credentials. There is no pretense of a revolving door because the door is just wide open all the time. The head of a major Chinese think tank is often a high-ranking party official, but even in the West, the line between an NGO and a think tank is becoming incredibly blurry.
That is a great point. Traditionally, we thought of NGOs as the people on the ground, the ones delivering food or medicine or digging wells, while think tanks were the people in suits in DC or London writing the strategy. But now, you see groups that do both. They write the policy, they lobby for the funding, and then they are the ones who get the government contract to implement the program on the ground.
It is vertical integration for the policy world. It is incredibly efficient if you are the one running the organization, but it creates massive conflicts of interest. If you are the one who wrote the report saying that a specific type of intervention in a foreign country is necessary, and then you are the one getting paid $50 million to carry out that intervention, are you really an objective researcher? Or are you just creating a market for your own services?
Of course not. You are a contractor. And that brings us back to the Iran conflict and the shadow fleets we discussed in episode 882. You see these policy papers coming out about how to strike the oil infrastructure or how to handle the shadow navies. And when you look at who is writing them, it is often people who have deep ties to the very industries that would benefit from those actions. It is the same thing we saw with the rise of the strongman era, which we covered in episode 860. These leaders use think tanks to provide a veneer of intellectual legitimacy to their power grabs.
They fund these international conferences in places like Davos or Munich and produce these glossy reports that talk about stability and security when what they are really talking about is maintaining control. It is about framing the conversation so that only certain options are on the table. If you control the research, you control the reality that the policymakers are operating in.
So, if I am a listener and I am seeing a news report featuring an expert from a think tank, what should I be doing? How do I actually vet this information? Because I do not have time to go digging through their tax filings every time I read an article or watch a 3-minute clip on the news.
That is the big question. And there are actually some great tools out there now that have become essential in 2026. There is a project called Transparify that specifically rates think tanks based on their funding transparency. They give them a star rating so you can see at a glance if a group is open about where their money comes from or if they are a total black box. There is also the Think Tank Funding Tracker, which is a fantastic resource for seeing the connections between specific donors and specific reports.
I think the most important thing is to always ask the question, cui bono? Who benefits? If a report is advocating for a massive increase in a specific type of surveillance technology, check to see if their board of directors includes executives from the companies that make that technology. If a report is pushing for a more aggressive stance against a specific country, check to see if they receive funding from that country's regional rivals. It sounds cynical, but in this environment, it is just basic due diligence.
It is not even about being cynical. It is about being an informed citizen in a world where information is a commodity. We have to treat policy papers the same way we treat any other form of media. We understand that a news network has an editorial bias. We understand that a politician has a platform. We need to start understanding that a think tank has a business model. They are not monks in a monastery. They are professionals in a marketplace of ideas, and that marketplace is heavily influenced by the people with the most capital.
I also think we need to be very skeptical of the expert consensus, especially during active conflicts like the one we are seeing with Iran. We have seen this over and over again, whether it was the lead up to the Iraq War 20 years ago or the current situation. There is this momentum that builds up in the think tank world where everyone starts saying the same thing, and it creates this illusion that there is only one logical path forward.
That is what they call the Borg in some circles. It is this collective consciousness of the foreign policy establishment. And if you are an outlier, if you are suggesting a different approach, you are not just wrong, you are considered unserious. You lose your funding, you lose your invitations to the right parties, and your career stalls. So the pressure to conform to the consensus is immense. It is a form of intellectual gatekeeping.
This is why I think the Quincy Institute is such an interesting case study. They were mentioned in the prompt as a group that is trying to do things differently. They have a very transparent funding model, and they are intentionally bipartisan, bringing together people from the left and the right who are skeptical of endless interventionism. They are trying to break the monoculture.
They are the exception that proves the rule. They were founded specifically because there was a feeling that the traditional think tank world had become an echo chamber. But even they face massive uphill battles because they are competing with groups that have 10 times their budget and decades of entrenched relationships in the government. When you are fighting against the combined weight of the defense industry and the established policy elite, transparency is your only real weapon.
It really feels like we're at a tipping point. The 92% cut in USAID funding that happened in early 2025 was a wake-up call. It showed that the old model of government-funded research is dying, and it is being replaced by something much more corporate and much more mercenary. We are moving from a world of public policy to a world of private strategy.
And that is why this matters to everyone, not just policy nerds. The ideas that are generated in these rooms today become the laws that govern your life tomorrow. They determine where your tax dollars go, whether your country goes to war, and how your data is tracked. If those ideas are being bought and paid for by people who do not have your interests at heart, then democracy itself is being bypassed. It is a way of making decisions without the messy business of public debate.
It is a bypass valve for the legislative process. Instead of having a public debate about a policy, you have a private consensus formed in a think tank, which is then presented to the public as an inevitability. By the time the public hears about it, the decision has already been made, the white papers have been written, and the experts have been prepped for their TV appearances.
So, what are the practical takeaways here? First, use the tools we mentioned. Check Transparify. Check the think tank funding tracker. Second, look for the dissenting voices. If every major think tank is saying the same thing, go look for the small, independent researchers who are saying something else. They might not have the same glossy reports or the same fancy offices in DC, but they might have more independence.
And third, do not be intimidated by the expert label. Just because someone has a title from a prestigious sounding institute does not mean their logic is sound or their motives are pure. Read the actual arguments. Look for the evidence. If the evidence is thin and the conclusion just happens to benefit a major donor, trust your gut. You do not need a PhD to spot a conflict of interest.
I think we are also going to see a move toward more decentralized open source policy research. With the tools we have now, you do not need a $20 million building in DC to do high quality analysis. We are seeing independent researchers on platforms like Telegram and Substack who are doing work that is just as rigorous, if not more so, because they are not beholden to a board of directors or a group of corporate donors.
That is a hopeful note to end on. The gatekeepers are losing their grip on the narrative. It is getting harder to hide the money, and as long as people are willing to look for it, the magic trick starts to lose its power. The more we understand how the gears turn, the less likely we are to get caught in them.
It really does. If you cannot see the money, you are not reading research, you are reading a sales pitch. It is as simple as that. We need to stop treating these organizations like neutral observers and start treating them like the interested parties they are.
Well, this has been a deep one. I feel like I need to go wash my hands after talking about all that dark money. But it is so important to understand these mechanisms. If you enjoyed this deep dive, please consider leaving us a review on your podcast app or on Spotify. It really does help other people find the show and helps us keep doing this.
Yeah, we genuinely appreciate the support, and if you want to stay up to date with everything we are doing, head over to myweirdprompts.com. You can find our RSS feed there, all our past episodes, and a contact form if you want to send us your own thoughts on this. We love hearing from you, especially when you send us prompts that lead us down these rabbit holes.
And do not forget to check out our Telegram channel. Just search for My Weird Prompts. We post there every time a new episode drops, and it is a great place to see the research notes and links to the episodes we referenced today, like the ones on the Iran conflict and reputation laundering. We will post the links to Transparify and the funding tracker there as well.
We have over 1,100 episodes in the archive now, so there is plenty to dig into if you are new to the show. We have covered everything from the return of big wars to the mechanics of financial decapitation. It is all connected, and the more you listen, the more the patterns start to emerge.
Thanks again to Daniel for sending in this prompt. It gave us a lot to chew on. We will be back next time with another exploration of the weird, the complex, and the hidden.
Until then, keep asking who benefits. This has been My Weird Prompts.
Thanks for listening. We will talk to you soon.
I am already looking at the next report, Corn. I think I found another one of those drone manufacturers in the donor list of a group talking about maritime security.
Of course you did. Let us take a look. See you, everyone.
Goodbye.
All right, I think we have covered the bases on the think tank world. It is a bit of a labyrinth, isn't it?
It truly is. But once you have the map, the walls do not seem quite so high. I was just thinking about the historical context we touched on earlier. You know, when Rand was first starting out, there was this sense of almost religious devotion to data. They really believed they could calculate the future. They had the whiz kids like Robert McNamara who thought everything could be reduced to a spreadsheet.
It is that high modernism, the idea that everything can be quantified and managed, but you cannot quantify human intent or the influence of a secret bank account. You can have the best data in the world, but if the person interpreting it is being paid to see a specific result, the data doesn't matter.
That is the ghost in the machine. And until we have total transparency, those ghosts are the ones making the big decisions. We are living in the world that the whiz kids built, but the spreadsheets are now being written by the highest bidder.
Well, let us hope the light we threw on it today helps a few more people see through the fog. It is about reclaiming the conversation.
I think it will. Ready for some lunch? I am starving. All this talk of dark money has given me an appetite.
Let us go. I think it is your turn to cook, by the way.
Was it? I could have sworn we had a policy paper that said it was your turn. I think I saw a chart that clearly indicated a shift in kitchen responsibilities for the second week of March.
Nice try, Herman. Nice try. You are manufacturing your own data again.
Well, I tried. Let us go.
See you, everyone. Thanks for hanging out with the Poppleberry brothers.
Herman Poppleberry, signing off.
And Corn, too. Talk soon.
One last thing. Corn, did you see that bit about the Atlantic Council and the sovereign wealth funds?
I did, but let us save that for the next time we talk about geopolitics. That is a whole other rabbit hole involving billions of dollars and some very questionable alliances.
Fair enough. To the kitchen.
To the kitchen.
Goodbye for real this time.
Bye.
Seriously though, the sovereign wealth fund connection is massive. It explains so much about the shift in Middle East policy.
I know, Herman. I know. Let us eat.
Okay.
This has been My Weird Prompts. Check out the website and we will see you in the next one.
myweirdprops.com. Do not forget.
We are out.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change